As people are joining, I just want to say thank you to everyone, our panelists, and our 220 or so registered viewers. Good morning in Washington, good evening in Jakarta, and whatever time it is wherever you are. I'm David Merrill of the U.S.-Indonesia Society, USINDO. Today, USINDO and the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, are pleased to partner to convene this special open forum on what can the G20 meeting do for the recovery of global food security. Today's topic is urgent. The world is now facing the possibility of a crisis in global food security. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, combined with other factors, there are widespread dislocations to supplies of wheat, maize, vegetable oils, fertilizers, natural gas, causing high prices and supply shortages. Coordinated public actions at the global level could prevent the worst outcomes. These are not easy to achieve even without a crisis. However, a crisis can sometimes help galvanize action. Global public interventions will be extremely hard to design, agree on, and implement, but they must be attempted. Fortunately, the November G20 meeting in Bali presents a unique opportunity to advance coordinated action on food security. As Peter has identified, two tracks would need to work hand in hand for the G20 summit to succeed on this. One is the diplomatic and institutional coordination processes by which decisions are made. And two, the hardest, is the actual substance of those decisions. The diplomatic track is working smoothly. Indonesia's G20 leadership has recently made global food security one of, or perhaps the highest, economic priorities for the G20. But on the substance, although discussion has started, the actual needed policies and programs are still largely to be formulated. Thus, today's program is an opportunity not only to build our shared understanding of this looming crisis, but also for starting on progress in identifying the ideas, principles, and potential actions that might be considered and agreed by the G20 summit members. Today, we have 5 distinguished panelists, all experts in their fields, who will build our collective understanding of these vital issues and the possibility for actions. I'll just mention them briefly here. Peter Timmer, a leading world authority on agriculture and rural development, who has published widely on these topics. Peter is Thomas D. Cabot Emeritus Professor of Development Studies at Harvard and has served as professor at Stanford, Cornell, and University of California, San Diego. He's also, and I met him when he was doing this, he had also worked closely with the Indonesian government on food and agricultural policy for over 3 decades, won their highest award for a foreigner for that. Jeff Curry is Goldman Sachs Global Head of Commodities Research and Global Investment Research, and a Goldman Sachs partner. He's responsible for conducting Goldman Sachs research on commodity market and dynamics. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us. Catherine Hollifield is with us. Currently, she is the World Bank's global lead on food security and program manager of the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program. Thank you, Catherine. Rob Voss holds a PhD and an MSc with honors in economics from the Free University of Amsterdam. He's the director of the Markets, Trade, and Institution Division at IFPRI since 2017, and he was previously at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, responsible for, among other things, food security and sustainable agricultural development. Thank you, Rob. Charlotte Heberbrand, now with IFPRI, previously served as Director General of the International Fertilizer Industry Association, composed of many countries in the fertilizer sector, including membership from emerging and development economies. And she will brief primarily on the fertilizer aspects of this complex issue. Each panelist will be allocated 10 minutes. After all 5 have presented, Peter will moderate a discussion among the panelists to bring out questions that need elaboration and see if there's some consensus on recommendations for the G20 or the direction to proceed. Following that, we hope to have time to go to Q&As from the audience. To submit a question, use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to type and post your questions. Peter, please begin. Thank you.
Thank you, David. My task is to provide some historical perspective on these topics so that the panelists can focus on the current issues for the G20. I've been active in this field, as David indicated, a long time, since the mid-1960s. So I draw heavily from my personal perspective on lessons learned as various food crises have emerged and then gone away. The world is facing a potential food crisis worse than any that I have seen since World War II, with a devastating war in Ukraine launched by Russia in February, the historic drought and heat wave in China, the uneven monsoon in South Asia, food supplies from several of the world's largest granaries are highly uncertain at best, and I must say genuinely scary at worst. In response to these events, the panel has been asked to consider what can the G20 do to help avoid a food catastrophe. To set the stage for their input, I think we have to recognize that food security is a fundamental element of national sovereignty. Historically, prices on world food markets have been quite unstable. In response, countries have sought domestic price stability by restricting food trade, exports and imports, to keep that instability outside of their borders. These trade restrictions then increase price instability in world grain markets. Those grain markets are a global public commons. And like all public commons, they can be destroyed from too many private incursions that claim their benefits. Important examples are the overuse of ocean fisheries, the dumping of greenhouse gases into the global atmosphere, causing climate change. Negotiations to protect these two global public commons have not been very successful. Global efforts to keep world commodity markets open to all traders, public and private, have been somewhat more successful, using rules adopted by the World Trade Organization. But trade interventions, barriers and subsidies to defend national security are legitimate even under these WTO rules. The key lesson then from world food crises since the mid-20th century is that food security is necessary for national security. The G20 now faces this question directly. How can the global public commons be defended against such legitimate incursions? Once we recognize that domestic political concerns override global rules, we can begin to formulate realistic proposals for collective action that might be possible at the G20 summit meeting in Bali in November, with Indonesia in the chair. A word of caution should be on the table. The track record of G20 initiatives on food security is not promising, despite the fact that such initiatives were agreed to at almost every summit since 2006. Sometimes the agreements were ambitious and never funded or implemented. Sometimes reality kept the agreements quite modest. The best known agreement, the initiative that created AMIS, the Agricultural Market Information System, in 2013, was led by Kim Anderson of Australia and Joe Glauber of the United States, two of the world's leading agricultural policy analysts. AMIS required all G20 participants to report in a timely fashion their food trade levels and size of grain reserves, in the belief that making such information available in a transparent fashion would build confidence in grain markets and reduce trade barriers. However, the reporting to AMIS is slow and cumbersome, and countries incur no penalties for inaccurate reporting of their grain stocks and policies, or not reporting at all. This is a sobering lesson and a daunting challenge. G20 commitments have no teeth. To work, they must be in each country's self-interest. To make progress on this challenge, the discussion should focus on actions and language that even large, vulnerable, and food insecure countries can sign on to, in the belief that the world community will help stabilize food, fertilizer, and energy markets and avoid panicked actions. The collective gains from an agreement to protect the global public commons, the resilience and depth of world grain markets, are very large, but they need to be clarified for all parties. Collective action is possible even without binding enforcement mechanisms. Since 2008, leaders of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, have met regularly to discuss national policies on food security and how changes in those policies might affect the world rice market. The region was heavily impacted by the 2008 rice panic, when the world rice market spiraled out of control despite adequate rice supplies. After the world market was stabilized by Japan's announcement in June 2008 that it would negotiate the sale of rice to the Philippines, rice stocks in importing countries of ASEAN were gradually built up to avoid getting caught in a rising price spiral. Countries learned not to panic by talking through food security issues at ASEAN summit meetings held twice a year. And there is evidence that the policy dialogue worked. The food price spike in 2011 included wheat, corn, and soybeans, and vegetable oils, but it did not include rice. World rice prices have been relatively stable since 2008. There are several initiatives that individual countries can take now, even before the Bali summit meeting in November. Efforts can be made to substitute rice and maize for wheat. Such substitution is relatively easy in a number of countries where rice consumption has been falling in favor of wheat products and grain-fed meat. China and India both have substantial populations where either cereal is acceptable in daily diets, and both countries have effective policy mechanisms to shift the balance of rice and wheat in those diets. A range of other actions is also available. The use of grain and vegetable oils to make biofuels can be reduced by changing government subsidies and mandates. In particular, the United States could free several million tons of maize for direct human consumption by reducing its mandates for ethanol use in gasoline blends. The impact on gasoline prices in the United States would be negligible. In a related move, grain feeding to livestock can be reduced through government guidance and market forces. Meat prices would move higher in countries that use intensive feeding operations to supply their high levels of meat consumption, but the action would free up very large quantities of feed grains for direct human consumption. In the coming months, all efforts should be made to avoid food protectionism. That said, governments have an existential interest in food security for their citizens. Efforts should be taken, especially by the international financial institutions, to help minimize the damage to the global public commons from limited trade barriers. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund in particular, regularly engage with member countries in policy dialogues, and in the short run, the message should be try to avoid restrictions on food trade. In the next several months, ASEAN needs to play a special role in keeping the world rice market reasonably stable by dealing with the factors that are causing these rice prices to rise sharply. The risks of a significant rise in world rice prices are becoming clear. The spotty monsoon in India and Pakistan has already reduced rice exports from the subcontinent, and India's new 20% duty on exports of all rice grades except parboiled and basmati rice reflects these pressures. We still don't really know what the impact of that is going to be because it only went into effect yesterday. Second, heat and drought in South China are reducing rice harvest prospects quite significantly, and China might turn to increased imports rather than draw down stocks. China is already the world's largest rice importer, and it exports some rice, but China mostly imports low-quality rice to feed livestock. Third, bad weather in the Philippines and a new government there might prompt large import tenders to a very nervous world rice market. Fortunately, several very experienced technocrats hold senior ministerial positions, so the government is not likely to act rashly. And fourth, Russia might bomb grain facilities and ports in Ukraine, and I think any renewed threat to Black Sea grain exports will spook world commodity markets. Of course, the G20 has broader and more difficult issues to deal with in 2022 for several sobering reasons. The success of the ASEAN Forum stems partly from the fact that it is a regional grouping of countries with a shared interest in keeping rice prices stable in local markets. Such common interests probably do not exist in the G20, with Russia and China actively trying to thwart common actions by the United States, European Union, and Japan. India seems determined to remain neutral. Whether diplomacy can find grounds for collective action on food security remains to be seen. There's cause for hope. As David indicated, China offered an 8-point proposal at the foreign ministers meeting in Bali in July for cooperation on global food security via the G20 summit. The 8 points are all familiar, but they indicate that China at the highest level is prepared to be part of a global initiative on food security. This is very good news. Let's hear it from the panel.
Now we turn to Jeffrey Curry of Goldman Sachs, London, head of commodities at Goldman Sachs. Jeff, please.
David, thank you, Peter. I want to say I've been following these markets and intimately involved since 1995. I'll tell you, it's the worst I've ever seen. When Peter, with his experience, tells you how tight these markets are, it tells you this is unlike anything we have ever seen before. And I want to emphasize, it's not just about food, it's energy, and it's the entire old economy. We started calling for a commodity super cycle in October 2020, really based upon what we call the revenge of the old economy. Underinvestment in the ability to supply and deliver these basic commodities into society. And at the core of this is that the returns in the sector were so low that capital was redirected into the new economy. Whether if it was into, let's say they preferred, I like to say they preferred Netflix over Exxon. And I'm not going to get into the other problems about Exxon, but it was the relative returns that saw capital be redirected into the new economy, creating the problems we see today. And I want to emphasize, it's not a coincidence that we're experiencing an energy crisis at the exact same time as a food crisis. When we think about food, it is identical to energy. Let me remind everybody, what is food at the core? Most of these things we're talking about, rice, wheat, corn, soybeans to a lesser extent. What are they? They are carbohydrates. I'm going to say that one more time, carbohydrates. The word carbon is in them. What is oil, gas, coal, they are hydrocarbons. The only thing separating a carbohydrate from a hydrocarbon is an oxygen. That is it. By the way, if you want to fly to Mars, you got to figure out how to take the oxygen in and out of the food and the fuel. So you eat the stuff with the oxygen and you put the stuff without the oxygen in your rocket booster. They are very similar. When we think about the underinvestment in energy, and I think as Peter alluded to, the biofuels, all of this, you're swinging the two in and out between the different demand sources. And so when you start to underinvest in one, you're underinvesting in all of them. And when we think about agriculture more specifically, I like to call it the 3 C's: carbon, conflict, and climate. These are the 3 C's that are impacting the agriculture market significantly. And by the way, I want to emphasize to everyone listening, I'm a big advocate of climate change. It's a problem that's paramount that we have to solve. But the methods in which we're going about it through ESG and other types of blatant underinvestment in key sectors is creating a massive misallocation of capital that is really at the core of this. And so what I want to do just quickly in the time I have left is talk about this idea of the revenge of the old economy and what's driving it and how we solve it. And I want to emphasize it is an investment problem. Solving this problem is not rocket science. We just need to put a lot of money to work to be able to grow the production capacity of many of these different commodity sectors. Now with agriculture, what's going to make it harder is we're battling the climate. So the areas where we need to make investments are moving targets on us. And then it's going to be much more difficult and aggressive than even in the energy sector. So let's start with the investment problem. Why do we call it the revenge of the old economy? It really has to do with these periods. In fact, we coined the term in February 2002 when the dot-com bubble, that new economy, imploded on itself, and it started that super cycle in the 2000s. Now, we have seen these revenge of the old economy cycles going all the way back to the 60s. Because think about what was the 60s? It was the nifty 50. Remember that big stock bubble that happened there? Interest rates were too low. So capital chased, and I figured out what this duration thing is interest rates are too low and capital goes after the long duration type of investments. And back then in the 60s, they preferred Coca-Cola, Gillette, brand names that were long duration. They're like meme stocks today. They prefer those over basic investment in agriculture, oil and metals and things of that nature. And then it teed you up for the 70s. And then you had a big surge in policy-driven surge in demand against that supply constraints, which was LBJ's Great Society, and exposed the severity of the supply constraints. It's the exact same story as today. And by the way, policymakers wanted to blame the OPEC Arab oil embargo on all those problems in the 70s, but they took advantage of the situation just like Russia is taking advantage of the situation today. You can't blame Russia for all these problems. The energy crisis was very apparent in the summer of 2021, but he started amassing troops somewhere around October 2021. So like the 70s, the policymakers are wanting to blame OPEC for the 70s, wanting to blame Russia like that. But at the core, it is this investment problem. So the 60s was the nifty 50s. What was the 90s? It was the dot-com boom, created the exact same dynamic. And then in the 2010s, it was the FANG boom. It created the same dynamic. So what happens is you go in the 70s, the 2000s, and by the way, your big policy demand surge in the 2000s was admitting China to the WTO. It's always a policy event. And this one was COVID, which then has exposed the severity of these supply constraints. So when we think about the situation right now, what I find absolutely amazing is that we have not seen any investment. Even in the 70s at this point, you'd seen investment. Even in the 2000s at this point, you'd seen in the investment. If anything, what we're seeing on our desks and everything is the investment going down, it's coming out. And one of the factors, it's very difficult to get investment into this sector. And there's 3 reasons. By the way, ESG is not at the top. Number 1 reason is the volatility is too high. As Peter alluded to, the markets are all over the place. Investors don't like that kind of volatility. And then number two, it's equally important, is there's a history of very bad returns in these sectors. Because they're, actually, as somebody put it to me recently, the average returns in some of these agriculture sectors are somewhere around 15%, but I've never seen 17 or 19%. And I think it goes to the point that that Peter was pointing to. It does this, and so it's very difficult to get the returns out of it, which then it discourages the investment. And then number three, I put with the ESG, that's discouraging the investment because a lot of this stuff is carbon, and they don't know how to treat the carbon. By the way, one thing we've always advocated, a carbon price is the correct policy mechanism to solve this problem, because then you don't distort the allocation of capital and create some of these distortions in the market. So we need to overcome these problems to get capital to come to the sector. And so when the market is resting that central banks are going to raise rates to deal with the inflation problem, which both food and fuel are a very important part of what's creating it. But I do want to emphasize that rate hikes, they are a cure for the symptom, which is inflation. They do not cure the illness, which is underinvestment. And so we need to think about policies that are directed at creating incentives to make investments in these sectors. And you cannot disentangle the agriculture markets from the energy markets. We need to think about them as a group, because remember, again, hydrocarbons and carbohydrates are only separated by an oxygen. And so when we think about the broader complex, we need to think about policies that incentivize investments across the different space, and do so in a manner that's consistent with dealing with the problems of climate change, because agriculture is impacted by climate change more so than any of these other markets. And so you got to think about all the three C's together: carbon, climate, and conflict. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much. Very illuminating. Now we move to Catherine Hollifield, Global Lead on Food Security at the World Bank. Catherine, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. And it's an honor to be able to speak with this great group today, and to provide a little bit of the perspective from the World Bank Group, and also from the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program. What I would like to do is give you a little bit of a sense of our framework for action. And the framework for action here is looking at both the point you raised earlier about the need for action at the global level, but the gap that is there in terms of actual implementation and action and support at the country level, which is critical in terms of actually seeing the kind of change and impact that's needed to actually build the resilience of food systems around the world. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the bank itself is specifically doing, share with you a little bit about the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, but also then circle back to fora where there are opportunities to actually try to facilitate and increase both investment, but also investment into the right kind of programs and policies to actually help heal the problem in the longer term. And I was very struck by some of the comments from my previous speakers in terms of Peter speaking about action on the G-20 and the global local, but also the point that Jeff was raising in terms of the more fundamental long-term problems that are there, and his 3 C's, and I hope I can pick up on those as well. When we look at the overall framework in terms of action right now, let me give a little bit of a sense in terms of going backward. I mean, we've been seeing the situation, the outbreak of war in Ukraine over the last 6 months. I do want to emphasize that this is an acute event which continues to exacerbate already dire and worsening trends in global food insecurity and nutrition. We've seen them trending up anyway, and these spikes, both with the impacts of COVID and then now even more prominently coming out of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, really have created a crisis which makes us focus not only on the response in the short term, but also keeping our eye on those kind of actions and policies and approaches that can help build the resilience of the system in the long term. Again, these 2 global shocks have just exacerbated and highlight the instability and the lack of resilience that we see across food systems. And it's that lack of resilience. We don't know what the next shock is going to be. So if we can support and take the kind of action that's needed to make the systems more resilient, to address and to look at the climate side of things. Again, climate is something that affects agriculture greatly, but agriculture and food are also areas that have the opportunity to build resilience. So that those are things I think that we need to keep in mind as we look at this as well. I do want to emphasize as well that the poorest remain very exposed to the risks of famine and starvation, goes without saying, but the uncertainties and volatility of food and fertilizer prices, adverse trade restrictions and protectionist policies, and the compounding effects of other major shocks such as economic stress, lingering COVID impacts, and natural disasters. This really is a layering of shocks, which dare I say it, I don't know. We don't know what the next shock is going to be. If you go back 2+ years, who would have ever imagined really that we would be facing these two waves that really compound what's happening in countries today? So the bank really has put in place essentially and is approaching this by looking at 4 different buckets of action that I'd like to emphasize. The first one picks very much upon the points that Peter had raised in terms of facilitating unhindered food trade. And this is where dialogue at the global level and the G20, the G7, and other forum are critical for having that discussions and trying to create that positive circle rather than the vicious circle, because we all know that when countries start placing restrictions on trade, it starts to snowball because there is the responses people have to be protecting and supporting their own countries. So this is really where strong consensus at the global and at the different regional levels is important. It is a public good, as Peter had mentioned. And to support that public good, we do need to have public action at the global level that then is reflected in the kind of policies and approaches that are taken at the country level. And it's been nice to see that some of the initial strong, possibly knee-jerk responses with the trade restrictions have been rolled back and things have stabilized, but that's always a risk. So continued focus on that. And for the World Bank, not only focus at the big global fora, but also in terms of our ongoing dialogue with developing countries. This is a part of our dialogue that we're doing. The second big bucket of support or critical support in the short term in particular is looking to support the consumers themselves. Buying power and making sure that they have the ability to actually enter into markets and that they are out there and able to actually access food through nutrition sensitive social protection programs. Again, the focus on nutrition. So I'm expanding the commodity base beyond the maize, wheat, rice, and recognizing that in the long term, we're also trying to manage and support healthy people and trying to diversify production in that way and diversify consumption. It's also about making sure that the financing there is available to support well-targeted nutrition sensitive social protection programs. That is something that's critical in the short term. But again, in the long term, keeping the targeting well so that the limited resources that are available can be most effectively used to support buying power of those that need it. The third big bucket I want to talk about is the big area of supporting producers. And here we see action required both in the short term, ensuring next season's production by removing input trade barriers, by focusing on more efficient use of fertilizer, repurposing public policies and expenditures to better support farmers. It really is about helping shorten and make more efficient not only production, but the supply chains, reducing food loss and food waste so that more food gets from the farm to the table. Other aspects like that, it really is critical to help make sure that there's more product out there, it gets delivered, and it gets delivered in a way that it does not put undue stress or the kind of stress that it currently puts on natural resources. So that's the second large bucket where the bank is very active in terms of having dialogue and implementing projects that actually provide the investment so countries can be utilizing climate smart approaches, can be looking to find ways to finance some of the public good aspects, the food loss, food waste aspects, and others, and really unleashing, building that up. The third part of this is really about the longer term in terms of making sure that the focus remains on building the sustainable food and nutrition security, sustainable food systems themselves, make them more resilient to the kind of risks we're seeing, whether it's conflict, climate, pests, diseases, but making sure that there is that balance, that when you're looking at short-term impacts, that you do build in and choose those kind of solutions that help build the resilience in the long term. So that's the fourth bucket that I wanted to emphasize. I talked a little bit about where the World Bank is. We are allocating and utilizing all of our crisis response toolkits, looking at our existing portfolio and making sure that it is fit for purpose given this new global context, restructuring and repurposing and providing additional finance. We have about 18.7 billion in this portfolio that we're trying to make sure gets redirected and focusing, you know, with this different context countries are facing. An additional $12 billion, up to $12 billion is also being provided for projects going forward, things such as policy lending, investment lending, and programs for results. The other tool that I'd like to specifically focus on again is the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, which is a program that is not a World Bank program. It's hosted at the bank, but it really does put in place a financing mechanism where additional grant resources can be put in to support countries' strategies to build those long-term systems, and the countries compete for the resources and actually look and make a choice between the Rome-based agencies, between the regional development banks and the World Bank, who is actually best placed on the ground to deliver the kind of program, the kind of activities necessary to respond to the crisis, but with those medium to long-term elements. As many may recall, this is actually one of the initiatives that came out of the G20 and the G7. It was launched after the last food crisis. I think at the time the target was to set aside $20 billion to finance this kind of building of the system. The results have fallen far short. About $2 billion has been provided. And I think this is where this kind of platform is something that really can serve part of the response, because it really is about bringing together the development community in a way to effectively use the resources to pick the top priorities that need to be financed. I think it's striking, and you know, Jeff was talking about investment from a private sector. I think investment a little bit more than from the public investment, but given the public nature of food security, given the critical aspects in terms of rebalancing a system that is currently faced, or a sector that is currently faced by many distortionary subsidies and programs that tend to not give us a true private market, actually providing public financing to rebalance and to move in the right direction, I think is critical at this time. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to emphasize as well is this point in terms of global action. And this is where initiatives such as the Global Alliance on Food Security, which was launched over the last year to really try to bring together and leverage more collaborative and joint action, I think is a critical element to help try and put in place both better information at the front end, the assessment of the situation, drawing from such things as Amos, which was raised earlier, and helping to give the forum where there is probably some peer pressure to make sure that people are living up to the global commitments that they've made. It is about having better sharing of information in terms of what is currently being financed in the public domain, so that there can be better targeting and that there can be better assessment in terms of what the gaps are and that the top priorities are financed, but also about accessing the kind of research and the kind of work that the CG system and others are doing, so that the innovative approaches to address the challenges, I think that Jeff laid out very well on the carbon side of things, so that we are freeing up and making sure that resources are being used in the most effective way, that those are being tapped into at the country level and used to help direct where the investment funding goes. This kind of forum, I think, is critical to not actually implement, but to provide the information so that every organization themselves has the best information possible to make the decisions in terms of where they finance and how they engage and support in the food system transformation. So let me leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to turn to Rob Voss. Rob is Director of the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division at IFPRI. Previously with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, he was responsible for, among other things, food security. Rob?
Thank you, David, and thanks for the invitation. It's a hard act to follow after such eminent speakers before me. I have a few slides to show, but particularly maybe it would be helpful to specify a bit more clearly the dimensions of this crisis. So first, this is a slide, a graph, which shows what everybody's talking about. Is the International Food Price Index, is the FAO index. There's other indices, but showing that food prices in international markets are at an historic high. It's important to emphasize that the increase and the surge that we are seeing after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that prices had already surged in 2021, and in the aftermath of the COVID and with the recovery of from the COVID recession, we saw energy prices go up, and along with it, also demand for food was back up, and that's caused a surge in prices. And with the Ukraine war, that was exacerbated. So we cannot just say that the invasion of Ukraine is causing this increase in food prices by itself. It's exacerbated, and it's important. Also, it's not in all commodities. It's particularly wheat, maize, and vegetable oils. But for instance, rice prices have remained relatively stable, and at the moment, rice prices are even below where they were 2 years ago. As Peter also mentioned, policy responses have also in good part been responsible of the recent surge, aside from the impact of the war, the disruptions caused by the war. We saw at some point by the end of April up to the mid-May that about 17% of global trade in food commodities was subject to export bans and restrictions, and that helped push up prices. And the 70% was expressed in kilocalories, or the carbons that Jeff was talking about in terms of what's covered. But since June, prices, particularly of wheat and maize and vegetables, have come down, in part also because some of the export restrictions have been phased out. So it's important, and that gives also the importance of avoiding these trade restrictions in markets. That said, so even if some of the prices have come down, the prices remain high by historical standards, and the risk of new surges are big because of tight markets, and we see a continued high volatility particularly in wheat and maize markets. Actually, the wheat market has been in excessive, according to an index that we update every day, in excessive volatility for almost a year now, continuously. Even before the war, it was already in high volatility. So that gives for a lot of uncertainty in markets, and any new shock could give rise to new price surges. Now, second dimension of what we're talking about is domestic food price inflation. If you look at this before the invasion of the war, the food prices were already high at domestic level, and the map has colored more reddish and even more purple, if you like, with the food price inflation stepping up to above 10% and or even in some countries well above 30%. And of course, this is what matters most to consumers. What happens to international market prices does not translate in all countries to higher domestic prices, either because they don't import that much food, and basically provide themselves, or they have good ways to insulate their populations from higher food prices. But the ones that are most affected are the low-income food importing countries, as well, of course, the poor, which are most vulnerable and consume much of their income in food. But the overall vulnerabilities and where we see the high food price inflation, the biggest vulnerability populations are not necessarily the countries that are most exposed directly to the impacts of the war itself, but the countries that had already an eroded import capacity because the efforts they made in fighting the COVID recession, the eroded fiscal capacity and macroeconomic policy space, as well as particularly in those low-income countries with weak domestic supply response to provide resilience and keep food prices low for their populations. Now, if we talk about food security crisis, this is the real crisis that we're talking about. This is what happens mostly in conflict-ridden countries and countries very vulnerable to climate shocks that face increasing levels of what we call acute food insecurity. So the numbers of people facing what's called crisis level acute food insecurity, meaning they would need immediate food assistance in order to survive and buy enough food to live on, has increased and has more than doubled since 2015. And the latest figure is from a report that will be launched on Monday, the mid-year update of the global report on food crisis. And the exposure to the international factors is also different. The famine in Yemen, very clear, is a country that has very high dependence on wheat imports. Wheat is the staple food that most people eat. But in the Horn of Africa, particularly Somalia, and these are the two countries there where famine warnings have gone out very recently. The problems are different and much more the combination of conflict, droughts, and other weather shocks, and on top of that, the economic shocks that may have both domestic or international origin. So with climate change, continued food market volatility, both international and domestic, and weak food system resilience, these adverse trends are likely to worsen. So immediate concern, in my view, should be with these food crises, although all the other dimensions I mentioned we should reckon with for longer-term solutions. So in line with what others have said, but maybe adding a few dimensions to it, what could the G20 do in response to this crisis to address the immediate concerns of those countries with lack of capacity to protect their population against food price inflation and lack of food access because of the factors I mentioned. The first thing would be they would need more external finance and support where the World Bank and the IMF could play a role, and hopefully also proposals would go out to put pressure on the joint agriculture and finance ministers meeting of the G20 that's scheduled for the 11th of October to step up efforts there for the countries in need. Likewise, also those countries that are most vulnerable also have currently suffer from high external debt burdens that also pinches on their fiscal capacity. So debt relief could be part of the equation. Now, given the countries we're talking about, that may also be tricky because they're conflict countries that people may not see as particularly strong to provide, to use this support to protect their populations. But I think if we don't help them in this sense, and the G20 steps up their efforts, then their food security problems will not go away. And likewise, provide adequate funding for operations of humanitarian agencies like the World Food Programme will be essential. But lastly, more structurally, moving from the short to the longer and term solutions, is to invest more in building resilience to global shocks and making food systems more sustainable. So first step in that direction could be to work harder to facilitate, diversify how countries source their food, both internationally through rich markets and nationally by diversifying also the reliance on staple foods. That would be a first step, and likewise for the fertilizer supply, which is important in some countries to keep up productivity levels. A point was already raised and which I made myself is refrain from trade restrictions on food and fertilizer trade is essential and can have a significant impact, particularly also on international food prices. The coordination of and establishment of an emergency food reserve mechanism could also help, at least in the short run, to manage that. It's also a controversial thing to do, to have publicly managed food reserve mechanisms and keep that within world trading rules, but it's certainly something that could be helpful, particularly to manage short-term shocks and avoid big price surges with any of the next shocks that may happen to global markets. But most importantly, how can we promote the development of resilient food supply systems? And among the proposals which we've made as IFPRI, along with the World Bank and a few other agencies, is how can we repurpose the existing support that governments currently provide to farmers and food supply chains more in general. When we're talking to the tune of $800 billion per year that government spends on such support measures, how can they be better repurposed to provide incentives to improve productivity, to make food supply chains more resilient and better integrated, and particularly also to make food practices much more sustainable to avoid extreme weather shocks in the future by addressing climate change. So that'd be a big challenge, but one of the things we proposed that the G20 develops a internationally concerted framework for such repurposing in order to guide that big amount of money towards better purposes and crowd in also private investments through better incentives in food markets. Let me stop there. Thank you, David.
Now, we're very interested to hear from Charlotte Heberbrand from IFPRI. She's not only with IFPRI for several years, but previously she served as Director General of the International Fertilizer Industry Association, which has hundreds of different countries in the fertilizer sector around the world, including developing countries. And we haven't really talked about the fertilizer component of this, and Charlotte will brief us on that. Charlotte, please.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. And IFPRI is really pleased to co-host this really interesting discussion. Let me start just by briefly saying at IFPRI, we also refer to the 3 C's, which have really wreaked a lot of havoc on food systems. And that is COVID, conflict, and climate change. In particular, of course, having a very heavy impact on low and medium income countries. And the fact that fertilizers remain out of reach for so many farmers today risks, in fact, aggravating the food crisis that we have entered already, and risks turning it into a much longer crisis, since clearly fertilizers foregone today lead to smaller harvests in the future and present a big problem. IFPRI is closely following the fertilizer topic, and I'm going to be drawing in my presentation on some of the work done by my colleagues, in particular David Laborde, James Thurlow, and Jinshen Diao. So thanks for pulling that up. If you can move to the first slide, please. So an important point that I think most of you are aware of, but it's worth perhaps emphasizing, is that the fertilizer sector is really vulnerable to supply disruptions. And that is primarily because just a very small number of countries are making up the bulk of global production. And you can see here that that is perhaps most striking for potash, one of the three major nutrients, where you can see that Russia and Belarus alone, of course, important countries in this context, supplied close to 40% of global potash production. So that is obviously a quite high figure. Next slide, please. So what that means is that trade, that the ratio between trade or imported fertilizers to overall consumption is very, very high. So of course, any production or trade shock will be widely felt around the world. And again, here, the most striking example is in the potash sector, where a total of 82% of global consumption is made up through imports. So again, quite a staggering number. Next slide, please. I think we've all seen this slide. Rob just showed it. It shows the price levels of energy prices, fertilizers, and grain. So I won't dwell on this too much. I think just to maybe re-emphasize a point that certainly Jeffrey has made very strongly, which is the very close linkage between energy, fertilizers, and grain. And in fact, fertilizers are probably the link, right, between energy and food prices, since one of the major nutrients, nitrogen, is heavily reliant still on fossil fuels for its production. With the recent increases in gas prices, in Europe, for example, where some nitrogen production has now been curtailed, natural gas makes up about 90% of the costs of ammonia production. Ammonia is the key building block for nitrogenous fertilizers. So that, I think, is really, really important to bear in mind. And then we know, of course, that affordability and availability concerns hit in particularly hard low and middle income countries. They have smaller markets, therefore are less likely to be able to even get fertilizers shipped to them in this demand crunch. As Rob alluded to, it's difficult for them to finance imports. There are also serious financing constraints in the domestic value chain in many of these countries because access to finance remains prohibitively high, the interest rates. And then the other important factor here hitting low and middle income country farmers, in particular smallholder farmers, is that they do not necessarily benefit from higher food prices because their prices may in fact not be increasing, or they may be producing just for a very small market or even for subsistence farming. So their fertilizer grain price rate or crop price ratio is not favorable for really investing in fertilizers. Next slide. So that is really, really problematic, especially considering that fertilizer use in many low and middle income countries has already historically been at relatively low levels. So here, for example, I just want you to focus on the lower corner where you see a lot of orange dots. Those represent sub-Saharan African countries, and you can see that despite some increases over the last few decades in fertilizer use, they are still really underusing fertilizers, and not surprisingly, their agricultural yields are also remaining on the low side. Next chart, please. So here I want to point to some really interesting work that IFPRI has just recently completed. We have looked at the impact which higher food, fuel, and fertilizer prices have on rural poverty in a set of 19 countries. And as you can see here, the red part of the bars shows you that for many here, we're just looking at the African countries among those 19 countries, that actually the impact of higher fertilizer prices is larger for many of these countries than the impact of higher fuel and food prices. So I think a very important takeaway from that important piece of work that IFPRI has just completed. And onto my final slide. If you think through about what can we do to address sets of difficulties, I've tried to kind of break them up into solutions that have to be done off farm, but there are also some important solutions that have to be done on the farm there. So again, I think we've talked about a lot of these things, so I don't think it's necessary for me to go through all of them. Let me maybe make a broader point here that the fertilizer issue really should be high up on the agenda of the G20. Why is that? Well, you've got in the G20 membership some of the top fertilizer producers around the world, and you also have some of the top fertilizer consumers. In fact, the 5 largest consumers of fertilizers are all in the G20, and that is China, India, Brazil, US, and Indonesia actually is the 5th largest consumer of fertilizers. I also want to point to the fact that Indonesia has pointed to the urgent need to tackle the energy transition. And that is, again, very closely linked to the fertilizer sector. There is now important work being done to decarbonize nitrogen production. I think we're still a long way away from that, but the fact that renewable energy prices are coming down does in fact allow us to move away from the famous Haber-Bosch process, which relies on natural gas to produce fertilizers, to using renewable energy and producing ammonia through electrolysis. So that's a very promising technology innovation that I think merits a lot of consideration. There are a number of pilot projects already taking place around the world, and increasingly, ammonia is also being looked to as a storage for hydrogen. So if and when we move into more of a hydrogen economy, that also becomes a very important new process that we need to be thinking about. Just briefly for the on-farm considerations, really, really important to tackle the fact that a lot of fertilizer use still is not really the most efficient. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done through extension, through outreach to farmers on the proper use of fertilizers and building fertilizer management into broader soil and agricultural management and in integrated soil fertility management. Let me also maybe just draw some attention to the topic of subsidies, because that is also closely linked to how farmers used fertilizers. We estimate that fertilizer subsidies contribute to about 50% of global fertilizer demand. So they're hugely important. They obviously provide access to fertilizers to farmers, but they are costly. And the fact that they are so costly when prices go this high often leads to sort of a kind of crazy volatility, right? Because countries may not be able to afford those levels of subsidies anymore. So I think a lot of attention could be placed here on how can we really move from the present system of subsidies to something that is smarter, more cost efficient, and that also leads to more sustainable fertilizer use. And this really fits very well into the topic of repurposing, which Rob Boss has alluded to. We often think about repurposing when we look at the large expenditures that developed economies provide to their agricultural sectors. But let me just point to the fact that fertilizer subsidies are also a very large component of those overall subsidies. So let me stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Now we're going to benefit from all of the panelists' suggestions. And I'd like to invite Peter Timmer to lead a 10 or even 15-minute discussion on what do we get out of all of these panelists' suggestions. The effort, at least in my view, is to see if we can, maybe not today, maybe next week or two, produce some coordinated and prioritized policy or action suggestions for the G20 leadership and the G20 members, including not least the United States, from what we have said today. Peter?
Thank you, David. Wow. I mean, I've been in this business a long time, and I want to say we just heard 4 of the most focused perceptive and useful set of comments that I have heard from a panel in a very, very long time. So I thank you for this. I've just learned a lot from listening to this. Obviously, there's no way I can summarize these comments, and I hope we'll have a little time for some interaction across the panel after my remarks here. But my takeaway is this is an incredibly complicated situation that we are in. The carbohydrates and hydrocarbon linkage, yeah, you know, we've sort of known about that for a long time, but that is just driving how the whole food climate interaction is going on. I thought Jeff's emphasis on long-term underinvestment in agriculture, but obviously much more broadly than that. I mean, we've been harping on this for a long time, and part of the problem is, you know, the private sector pretty much by necessity has to respond to the market signals that they see. That is not true of the public sector. Of the ADB, the World Bank, foundations, NGOs have the opportunity to take a longer term view of scarcity and be counter investing vis-a-vis the private sector. And one of the great failures of post-World War II history is that virtually all of public sector investment in agriculture is directly correlated with the price of grain in world markets. It's just driven by what the public decision makers see as short-run scarcity. We need somehow to have a mechanism for the big, important public investments to have a longer-term vision of where the scarcity is and not get caught in those short-run dynamics. Beyond that, all the commentary, the conclusions, I've got pages of notes here. Let me just try to put a very brief, I think this won't take more than 5 minutes, a brief framework to integrate these. And then I hope that we'll have time to let the panel interact directly. I mean, I've got a dozen questions for each person, but I'll restrain myself. But I do hope we'll have some time for further interaction. Yeah, we just heard that this situation is very complicated, and several speakers pointed out the COVID-19 pandemic had already put the stress on global supply chains and on local economies. So the reduced fiscal space that the local economies have as they had to cope with the COVID-19. That's one of the key things as we try to figure out how are we going to fund food distribution schemes if these governments are already stressed in fiscal terms. Those disruptions, the COVID disruptions, caused widespread shortages in vulnerable and conflict affected areas. Conflict is one of those Cs that keeps coming up. But world food prices were at historic highs before Russia invaded Ukraine. But the invasion changed, I think the invasion changed the world food supply situation in fundamental ways. And Charlotte just emphasized, well, look, guys, that's where you're getting most of your potash in world markets. If you don't have that, we're in trouble a year and 2 years down the road. Changes not just wheat, vegetable oils, maize directly affected. The fertilizer shortages are emerging, I think, now for the medium run. It's pretty clear crop productivity is going to be reduced next year and further out, perhaps. Holding weather constant, reduced fertilizer use is going to mean lower yields, and that means the bumper crops that we need to rebuild grain reserves now are simply not going to happen. We're going to have to live with these shortages for longer than we had thought, perhaps even 6 months ago. energy supplies have been badly disrupted in the short run. I think they're going to be affected in all time horizons. But the long run impact of high energy prices, I think, is going to spur development of renewable energy technologies and investments. I was struck, we're going to use ammonia to store hydrogen as part of a hydrogen economy. There's technologies out there that are beginning to look actually realistic when they were clearly blue sky five years ago. But the short and medium run impact of the energy prices clearly going to raise the cost of food all along the supply chain, at least the supply chain as it's structured at the moment. Farm inputs, farming activities, processing, transportation to retail outlets, even the household costs of shopping for food and getting it home. Food price inflation is only going to slow gradually, and it's going to put a lot of political pressure on policymakers in all the countries that we're interested in, from the United States to Yemen and Somalia. In light of all of these developments and the ones that we've heard from the panel, I think a G20 agenda on food security might include the following issues, and I'm trying to be really hard-nosed and pragmatic here rather than blue sky. The most basic principle of the G20 communique would have to be to protect food security for everyone in these difficult times by encouraging countries to act in the global public interest. And that means avoiding trade barriers to movements of staple foods, fertilizer, fuel, as a way to preserve and enhance the global public commons. The problem with that, as I think we all understand, is that restrictions on food trade are used routinely by countries to defend their own national food security. Any dislocations to food supplies in other countries do not weigh in these domestic political calculations. So one challenge for the G20 summit meeting is to craft a formal food security communique that has incentives for member countries to include the external costs in their internal political decision making. And I think the ASEAN experience with rice is a useful guide to meeting that challenge. It has quietly coordinated rice policies of member countries as they affect imports and exports of rice. And the approach is really very simple. It's a programmed dialogue at each semi-annual meeting of ASEAN leaders to discuss member plans for the domestic rice policy. Each country has to come prepared to discuss that. The high-level dialogue is preceded by technical discussions among trade and finance ministers who then brief the leaders. And that seems like a simple-minded approach, but it's been surprisingly successful. ASEAN has no enforcement mechanisms for if there are individual countries that want to go do something that will adversely affect world rice prices. There are no mechanisms to say you can't do that. But the forum and the dialogue have worked through peer pressure. Maybe that's more effective in Southeast Asia than in the rest of the world, but it has worked. And a comparison of historical world rice prices with world prices for wheat and rice is really illuminating. Rice prices used to be much more unstable than wheat and maize because of the very thin world rice market. And the opposite has been true since 2008, despite the fact that the world rice market is still quite thin. And we can thank the ASEAN Forum for that achievement, but I think we have to ask the ASEAN Forum to step up tomorrow to be sure that what's going on in India does not, in fact, spook the world rice market and cause a blow up in rice prices. If rice prices were to double in the next 2 weeks, I think we're in really deep trouble everywhere. If we can keep the rice price increase from the low quality rices in world markets at 10 or 15% rise over the next 2 weeks, I think we can manage. Now, establishing a neutral forum more globally under G20 auspices, where potential actions that could panic world food markets would be discussed and possibly diffused, I think has the potential to be a big step forward toward preventing an even worse food crisis than is already on our doorstep. Such a forum would be temporary and as informal as possible. I think the Chinese proposal tabled in July lists all the existing agencies and groups working in food security. None of that list are tailored to have fast responses to pending policy interventions that might cause significant price shocks on world markets. I think Indonesia would be a credible chair of a forum for dialogue on food security, a new entity, and it could regularly inform all the other institutions and agencies about the deliberations held under its auspices. The forum's mandate could expire, when world food markets return to more normal price levels. The mandate might be expanded at subsequent G20 meetings if necessary. The World Bank has both financial resources, technical skills to help make it work. And I think we heard from Catherine, there's clear breadth of interest in the World Bank in being part of the solution to this. I would love to have brief comments from each of the members, maybe just work in the order in which they presented originally. And, from Jeff to Catherine to Rob to Charlotte. Does that work, David? Can we just?
Yes.
Okay.
Jeff, please, your comments and suggestions.
Yeah, I think, the comments, that I focus on is really around, around the policy decisions, creating, an environment that's conducive to both investment as well as free trade. I think one of it came up over and over where the policies that were hindering not only investment, but trade itself. And that's been a problem with these markets going back for decades. And if there's ever been a time in which the world needs this, it's right now, particularly given the severe shortages. So that would be, one that we definitely see in our space. The other one is focusing on policies to take out some of the risk for investors. The U.S. has the farm subsidy programs and so forth, because really, I saw one of the questions on there was, why don't people invest in this space? It's too volatile. It's too dangerous. That's why investors are afraid of it, and that's why areas where you see production growing very quickly are areas in which investors are protected in some shape or form from that volatility. So that would be one of the other areas I see.
Right, exactly. Yeah, good.
I guess I'll go next. Yeah, please. I was struck by and wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of global dynamic in terms of commitments and holding people to commitments, making commitments, the fora for discussion. And I'm not sure how, if I mention the Global Alliance for Food Security again, you talked about creating an open fora. That was intended to be a very open fora, temporary, for those interested in actually taking action on food security globally, could come together, share information, and discuss ways forward. It does include a relatively broad participation in action right now. To me, you mentioned this point in terms of peer pressure. And I think even going beyond that into public pressure and transparency of information. I'm not sure how much peer pressure when you start getting into the political economy of approaches and subsidies and the different actors and different players along the value chain that can bring, that want to protect the kind of markets and the kind of engagements that they have. I do think trying to find a way to make information available so that there is broader awareness of where the resources go, and that there is sort of that pressure through the electorate, maybe through democratic processes, to try and have things change. So this is where having some kind of fora and having people live up to their commitments. I think you had said earlier that even with Amos, it's difficult to get people to provide the information needed so that there is full availability of what's happening out there, the context. And I think pushing and getting commitments for people to actually live up to and share what their assessment of the situation is, how they are currently supporting, where they are putting their financing right now, and to on the other side of things, make available more readily the kind of amazing things that are happening on the ground that can solve through innovative measures the work that IFPRI and the CG system is doing, and trying to have that disseminated more strongly and financed and picked up by the public money and private monies that are out there. Those elements, I think of it, are critical to try and shake up the complex network of subsidies and unclear in terms of where the public money actually rests, where the investment money actually goes, because it really, the point that Charlotte had made, that when food prices go up, it does not necessarily go to the farmers. I mean, it's been proven by OECD analysis of this. I think in India, farmers are taxed when you go, finally, at the end of the day, when you look at all the public subsidies, and I don't think people are aware of that. So how do you try and develop constituencies for change that can actually move the needle and change the direction, and make sure that the investments that go in and the money that's on the table is used more effectively? I'll leave it at that.
Jump in here. I think, Peter, you
Yep.
gave an excellent summary of what we discussed and proposed, and gave a nice framework also how we can translate it to what the G20 actors could follow through upon. Just 2 points I want to raise, which link also what Catherine was saying. First, even though we have a lot more information and, if you like, transparency with data, particularly in international markets, we fall pretty much short in terms of how can we foresee tensions in markets and
Yes.
food crisis risk. So one of the things we're trying to get done, also with support of donors, so we're working hard on that, is to focus a lot more first on what are the food crisis risks, and just monitor multiple risks, and then try and translate that. Okay, what does it mean for food security? And one missing factor there is we know a lot about international food prices. They're easy to monitor on a daily basis. But when it comes to domestic food prices on a consistent basis within specific to countries or comparable across countries, we fall well short. So just as one factor. So I think to be more preemptive and preventative for next crisis, we need monitoring mechanisms that can analyze and monitor much better the food crisis risk. Second point is just to reiterate the point that I also made in my presentation. I think there's enormous scope for doing a lot more and a lot better with the current subsidies governments provide, but that will require good international coordination, because the amount I mentioned, 800 billion, is very unevenly distributed across countries. So China alone gives more than 200 billion per year in support, but also EU and the United States are big providers in terms of that absolute amount. And the low-income countries, they also provide support, and a lot of it is inputs, subsidies, but their bandwidth to do so is much smaller. So if we want to reset, and that I think is very important for also private investors, and to take out uncertainty in markets, we can reset incentives that drive very strongly to provide incentives for more investment in sustainability, in integrating better food supply chains, making them more resilient, and hence taking away uncertainties to investors in the sector, be it small or big. That would be great good and much needed, and particularly also to fight climate change. So I think that's an agenda where we're trying, but it's a hard call because of the political resistance to do so, is to reform the existing support measures and think it through the repurposing, both from what can be done better with it in national context, but also what's needed to make that happen through international coordination.
Okay, so I think from my side, 3 points, and I know we're short on time. So I think prior to this crisis, fertilizers were viewed as an environmental problem, right? And that actually continues to be a very important topic. There are significant losses of fertilizers to the environment. Not enough is taken up by the crops. That by all means needs to remain a focus. We need to diversify fertilizer production. We need more innovative fertilizer products, and we need to make organic fertilizers more rich in nutrients so that they can actually also provide more nutrients to the crops than they can today. But having said all that, this crisis has shown how crucial fertilizers are. We just have to look at a country like Sri Lanka, which has undergone now a season without fertilizers or very little access to fertilizers, and the results are disastrous. My second point has to do with the trade rules. And I think, Peter, you made an excellent point in your introduction saying, actually, the fact that we've got these trade rules on agriculture have served to protect, in a way, this global public good. But I think what we've learned today, and we're all aware of this, is that the rules maybe were primarily focused on the rights of exporters. And now we really need to, I think, balance that and make sure that importers also are protected. So it's not just about ensuring that importing countries lower their tariffs, but importing countries also need to have some supply assurances. And it's been a little bit disheartening, I think, to see the drawn out discussions on this at the WTO, where even a humanitarian exemption from export restrictions for World Food Program purchases is so difficult to agree to. And again, we shouldn't only be talking about food, but also fertilizers when we talk about the really negative impacts of trade restrictions. And then my last point, just to reiterate, everybody has talked about the need for greater transparency. And AMOS, which was in fact, I think, as Catherine pointed out, something that grew out of the G20, is beginning also to look at fertilizers. So that is, I think, a welcome development, and one that needs to be, we need to understand a lot more about fertilizer market movements, and I would say reserves is another little bit of a black box where perhaps some greater clarity would be helpful and could help to calm markets actually at times like this. So thank you very much for a really great discussion.
Peter, do you have a comment now? Otherwise, I want to read one question.
I would like just to put the 5 key points that we heard on the table. Volatility is a huge impediment to efficient investment. A lot of it is policy induced. That was Jeff's point. We need to rethink subsidies across the board, fertilizer subsidies, but agriculture subsidies in particular. I heard some public pressure. Is public pressure a way to get countries to behave in the public, to get large countries to behave in the global public interest? I have to tell you, India's actions yesterday in how they structured their 20% tariff duty on rice was clearly designed with the possibility with the realization that if they screwed up, there was going to be enormous global pressure on them, and they don't want that. They would like to be seen as a leader in this field, and so they structured those duties in a way to do minimum damage to the world rice market. Fertilizer, we just haven't talked enough about fertilizer over the last 20, 30 years. It's been an environmental problem. Yeah, you need it to grow, to have higher yields, but it's been an ad hoc policy item rather than a clear focus in the energy, fertilizer, grain continuum. And I just totally agree with Charlotte that we need to figure out how to make fertilizer more broadly efficient. And then this last point about trade policy, we need more role for importers in those discussions. Clearly the WTO is kind of hamstrung with its rules at the moment because exporters dominate, but somehow we need to figure out a way to make whatever rules we're going to try to enforce. We need to make them fair for the importers as well as for the exporters. Let's face it, it was the United States that designed these rules, and it was a big exporter of grain. It wanted to protect its interests. We need now to figure out a way to broaden the rules so that importers have much more say in any rules that we try to enforce. And by that, I will stop. Thank you.
All right, this has been a fantastic panel. There are 3 or 4 questions that I'm not going to go into now for lack of time, but I will send them to the panelists. One in particular is whether the G20 recommendations can target or focus on the most impacted countries particularly or not. But I'll forward those to all the panelists. And Peter will take the lead, and I will certainly help him to the best of my ability to draw up some conclusions from this panel. It will not require institutional sign-off. I know that's a problem, but we will circulate it and give the opportunity to comment without necessarily institutional sign-off unless people want to do that. But the key is to get some recommendations, even draft recommendations, done and brought to the attention of the right people. Thank you all so much for participating. And I agree with Peter, this is one of the best panels I've participated in and had the privilege to join. Thank you all very much and have a good day and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.